Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, why do some people reject the teaching of the Buddha? Do they dislike it or disagree with it? Do they regard it as false?
Sometimes it's not as complicated as a doctrinal or philosophical disagreement. Sometimes they worry that worshipping the Buddha may anger their own gods, or it may cause them to forget and neglect their own beliefs, their own identity, or their own history.
Fascinating. But the Buddha and his teaching leave room for worship of one's own gods, do they not? There's no rule stating that the Buddha is the only object of worship.
This is true, but it's not clear if the historical Buddha is more like a god or a man, and many look upon the whole entourage of bodhisattvas, devas, and asuras as a pantheon of gods themselves. So anywhere the Buddha's teaching goes, so too does worship of this pantheon.
I see. What do people do about their own local gods and spirits when the Buddha's teaching arrives?
Sometimes they will allow only a small portion of people to worship the Buddha in case of the potential for anger among their local gods. Other times, worship will be adopted by the majority, but there will be a minority of people who reject the Buddha and stick to worship of their gods. Most commonly, however, there comes to be a synthesis of the two kinds of worship to the point that they grow together organically.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we will be discussing anti-Buddhist sentiment in Japan. What is the history of anti-Buddhist thought in Japan? What is its social and political context? What is the state of Buddhism in Japan today? So, let's get into it. What is the history of anti-Buddhist thought in Japan?
This question is fascinating because many people in the West think that Japan is a deeply Buddhist country and always has been. It is part of the myth and mysticism in the Western imagination of East Asia. Common misconceptions are that Zen is the official indigenous religion of Japan, or at least one of them, or that all Japanese people are by default Zen Buddhists. This isn't true at all, and in fact there is a whole history of anti-Buddhist sentiment in Japan that goes back to the beginning of Japanese Buddhism. This doesn't mean that Japan is an anti-Buddhist country. We will talk about the state of Buddhism in modern Japan today near the end of the episode. But naturally, not everybody thinks or feels the same way all the time in a given place. So, you will remember that Buddhism entered Japan in the 6th century CE via emissaries from what is now South Korea, then called the Kingdom of Baekje. When the emissary arrived and gave Emperor Kinmei of Japan various ritual materials, sutras, and images of the Buddha, the emperor had a decision to make. He asked the two most powerful political factions in his court if the Buddha should be worshipped in Japan or not. The Soga clan really wanted to worship the Buddha, but the rival Mononobe clan thought that it would anger the local gods and spirits, known as the kami. The kami were thought to govern the natural forces of the land, or even be natural forces themselves, and so to anger them would be to unleash storms, earthquakes, tsunamis, famines, floods, droughts, fires, epidemics, and more. This was a very real fear and concern, and Emperor Kinmei, in the interest of compromising between the factions, allowed the Soga clan to take up Buddhism as a test. While there was actually an epidemic and some civil unrest which Mononobe clan ended up blaming on the Soga clan became much more politically and financially powerful than the Mononobe clan, and since they strongly patronized Buddhism in their lands, the cat was out of the bag. So Buddhism began to spread around Japan. The Mononobe clan did not fade into nothingness. They still maintained their conservative stance against adopting a foreign religion, but they did not have the power or resources to do anything about it. Their rejection of Buddhism on the grounds of angering the native kami never went away, and proves a common thread through many anti-Buddhist movements in Japanese history. From the 6th century to the 17th or 18th century, Japanese Buddhism flourished. The imperial family became the strongest patron of Buddhism, and it syncretized, mixed, and melded with traditions of kami worship that were already ongoing. Kami became Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and Bodhisattvas and Buddhas became kami. But during the Edo period, which lasted from 1600 to 1868, under the legalistic military government of the Tokugawa shogunate, there was an explosion of literacy and commerce. alongside a renaissance of texts thought to contain the origins of Japaneseness. These include classical poetry and literature, but also myth-historical texts such as the Nihon Shoki, the Kojiki, and the Fuso Ryaki, and other early texts that purport to discuss the origins and history of the Japanese people, culture, and history. These texts enjoyed a resurgence, causing pro-imperial family sentiment. This was not good for the military government that forced the emperor to be a mere figurehead ruling from the city of Kamakura. There was also a resurgence of kami worship, especially as related to this pro-imperial family sentiment. There come to be new editions and commentaries of texts containing what will eventually be Shinto myths that prop up the imperial family and the Japanese state and people as being divine incarnations and descendants of the kami, particularly drawing their lineage all the way back to the sun goddess Amaterasu. During this time, the Tokugawa government also tightly regulates all commerce and information that comes from foreign sources, and so a slightly xenophobic sentiment trickles down from those policies into regular everyday society, leading to suspicion about Buddhism as being an imported religion from foreign lands. It is common in Japan and in the West to think that during the Edo period, the Tokugawa government's legalistic border control policies, collectively called sakoku, or closed country, meant that nobody was allowed in or out of the country of Japan during this time period. This is imagined as a golden age of Japanese history, where Japan was a pure ethno-state with zero immigrants, and that during this time, the Japanese focused inwardly on developing their own unique culture and technology without any foreign influence. This idea is completely wrong. This is a revision of history that serves anti-immigration sentiment in the modern era, and it's a repeat of the nativist and ethnocentric rhetoric that took place in Japan during the Edo period and led to the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate and the rise of the Japanese Empire. Instead, during the Edo period, there were 4 ports through which trade and cultural exchange with China, Korea, Portugal, and the Netherlands, and the Ryukyu Islands to the far south took place. Japan did not, quote, build a wall and make Korea pay for it, unquote. Instead, the government monitored and regulated travel and commerce across their borders, much like pretty much every country in the world does today. After the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate and the ascension of Emperor Meiji in 1868, these rumblings of nativism and pro-Shinto and pro-imperial family sentiment boil over into an all-out persecution of Buddhism, known in Japanese as Haibutsu Kishaku, which translates to abolish Buddhism, kill Shakyamuni. This movement was sponsored and encouraged by the wealthy elite in Japan because the alternative, state Shinto, propped up the power and authority of the imperial family and the aristocracy. During this persecution, some temples and sutra repositories were burned and destroyed, and other temples were closed for good. Additionally, monks were forced to become Shinto priests or forced back into society as laypeople, and the financial resources of Buddhist institutions were seized and deposited back into public funds. There were also some legal edicts which were part of this as well. For example, there was a policy called Shinbutsu Bunri, which mandated that all Buddhist and Shinto icons and rituals which had previously grown organically together on the same sites be separated physically, and that Buddhist and Shinto clergy be prohibited from engaging in rituals that were part of the other tradition. That is, Shinto clergy could not do Buddhist rituals and vice versa. For more on Haibutsu Kishaku, you can check out episode 85, which will be linked in the show notes. The Meiji period lasted from 1868 to 1912, and since then there have not been anti-Buddhist movements on the same scale as Haibutsu Kishaku. We can talk about some of the reasons for that in a moment, but one of the primary reasons I want to mention now is that in many ways, these persecutions successfully forced Buddhist institutions to reorient in very significant ways. They had to take the back seat to state Shinto. They had to find new sources of funding. They had to cope with increasing anti-religious sentiments in Japan by altering and reimagining doctrinal stances and ritual services. As a result, Buddhism has, in some ways, been in its death throes in Japan for the last 100 years.
So basically, Haibutsu Kishaku kind of falls out because it succeeded and the job was done.
In many ways, yes.
So continuing on from that, what is the social and political context for anti-Buddhist thought in Japan?
I would hope that on this show we have talked enough about how Buddhism is a religion. But religions are also social and political institutions, and Buddhist clergy and authorities in Japan used their influence to advance their own interests in political and social realms. Much of the anti-Buddhist thought in Japan has been related to diminishing its social and political power and influence. Buddhist institutions in Japan have at times been very, very wealthy, very politically powerful, and very socially influential. And there are and have always been people who seek to challenge or change that power and influence. Some people in modern times contest that power and influence on its own grounds, saying that no religious institution should have an outsized influence on government and politics and society, while others in the past have contested it on the grounds that they think that their religio-political faction should be the one to have influence and nobody else's. To explore this idea, we should discuss some of the political leanings of Buddhist institutions as well as their wealth and societal influence. In the early Tokugawa period, the 1600s, Buddhism was still the primary religious influence in Japanese culture and society. Most of the art and literature created during this time contained strongly Buddhist themes, images, motifs, and ethics. Additionally, these institutions were becoming incredibly wealthy through the sale of omamori, the increase in ritual duties, and the patronage of Buddhist monks as artists and artisans. So, Buddhist temples had a lot of money and a lot of material wealth in art, relics, and land, and they had a lot of members and patrons for whom they performed ritual services. But not only that, they also had become very close to the Tokugawa government, with many Tokugawa shoguns continuing to be practicing Buddhists, just like the emperors. This afforded Buddhist figures a lot of influence in political matters. One thing that they were very influential on was anti-Christian policies. They had a lot to do with the prohibition of Christian missionary activity in Japan, as well as with the reformation of the Dankadera system, which we discussed in our Omamori episode, and which would prove their downfall. Even without the element of Buddhism being foreign to Japan, this amount of power and influence was something worth being suspicious of. Combine it with the resurgence of interest in kami worship and in the imagined golden ages of Japanese history, when it was ruled directly by an emperor and not by a military government that limited the political and social power of the emperor to a mere figurehead, and you have a recipe for persecution. So the shogun was under immense pressure. He had to do something about Buddhist institutions having so much power, or else face rebellion from the nativists and the anti-Buddhist thinkers. But he also had to do this without alienating the Buddhist institutions, which could also lead to rebellion. As we have seen, the shogun eventually folded to anti-Buddhist pressure because that faction represented the greatest threat to his power, and he started systematically dismantling Buddhist institutions' influence on the government. However, the anti-Buddhist fire had been lit, and it would burn out of even the shogun's control, resulting in the restoration of direct political power to the emperor. This is a tragic oversimplification of the sequence of events, to the point that I would get in trouble with my professors if they listened to this podcast, but it gives some context and some supporting information about what happened.
What is the state of Buddhism in Japan today?
Buddhism still exists, and is indeed still practiced in Japan today. It did not die out, even if its wealth and influence on culture and society has shrunken down a great deal. Buddhism lives on, but it is being starved out in many ways by modernity, secularity, and globalism. Many of the Tokugawa period policies that we've discussed in this and previous episodes put a great deal of financial strain on Buddhist institutions. The closure of temples, seizure of assets, defrocking of monks, new legal and ritual duties of Buddhist temples, and the decrease in membership over the end of the Tokugawa period and on into the Meiji period nearly destroyed Buddhism in Japan entirely. Shinto became the state religion with the Meiji Restoration, and the making of empire became the religion of Japan until the end of the Second World War. The things that kept Buddhism alive during that time also kept it very poor, such as taking on constant funerary and memorial rituals, or temples being inherited by clergy members' sons rather than being staffed through government-sponsored monastic networks. After the war, the influx of Western science, modernity, urbanism, materialism, rationalism, and consumerism has thrown a wet blanket on many people's religiosity. People in rural regions have moved into cities. People who would otherwise become monks are instead getting jobs and starting families. And the existential questions and spiritual needs that people have had and that would have turned them to Buddhism in the past are instead now turning them towards science, consumerism, and secularity. People still visit temples regularly, and they make offerings, and they buy omamori, but there are fewer and fewer monks because it is a very financially poor and difficult life to lead. Compared to going to work at a company, it is much harder to financially sustain oneself. I mentioned earlier that temples are inherited. However, many temples are closing down all across Japan because a monk will die and his son will refuse to take over the temple because he lives in a city and he has a job, a family, etc., and he can't just quit all of that to become a full-time monk. I also mentioned how Buddhist institutions have primarily become funerary institutions. It's important to note that Shinto and kami worship has this idea that death and dead things are morally polluting and dirty and deleterious. So there is a stigma against becoming a monk because when you are a monk and you have all of these funerary and memorial ritual duties, you have to handle dead people a lot. If you become a monk and thereby become a mortician, nobody wants to get close to you because there's this subconscious cultural feeling that death radiates outward from you. This is contagious in a way that makes you and your home and your relationships dirty and highly susceptible to misfortune, yokai, or pretas. This makes it even less attractive to become a monk if you already have a job where you don't handle dead people and you make plenty of money and you have a family and a home in a city. Still, there have been some adaptations that keep Buddhism alive in Japan for now. For example, the explosion of new religious movements in Japan in the late 19th and early 20th century helped a lot. NRMs present themselves as modern and secular alternatives to older traditional Buddhist institutions, but they really aren't, as we discussed in episodes 29, 31, 66, and 93, which will be linked in the show notes. They contain a lot of Buddhist doctrines and rituals, and they're often affiliated with Buddhist sects and temples, and they also make use of Buddhist ecumenical and organizational structures. However, NRMs are also dangerous because they can often be cults of personality, or just straight-up cults. Or they can be radical political organizations who reinforce their political platform with religious arguments, or at least make the political radicalism go down easier. For more on that, you can visit our episodes on NRMs such as Risho Koseikai, Soka Gakkai, and Om Shinrikyo. Those are, again, episodes 29, 31, 66, and 93, and they'll be in the show notes. Another adaptation is the globalization of Buddhism. Buddhism has become very popular in the US and Europe. More and more Westerners are patrons of Buddhism and are even becoming monks and nuns themselves. At my local temple, 40% of the members are Japanese and the other 60% are non-Japanese, predominantly American. Because of this, many historically important temples in Japan have become very popular tourist sites for people from all over the world. For example, the most famous temples in Japan, such as Koyasan, Todaiji, Kofukuji, and Toji, get a huge amount of money from tourism revenue, which helps support them a lot. They are all free to visit, but they sell omamori and souvenirs, which create huge amounts of revenue, and they also have paid experiences like museums and tours and such. Additionally, tourists very commonly make monetary donations of a few hundred yen, or a few US dollars, at these places when they visit, and that helps a lot too. While this is a good thing, it is still fraught and complicated, because a portion of this Western audience imagine Buddhism to be a mystical New Age Far East alternative to Christianity, or they think of it like a tourist attraction or a spectacle to marvel at as one would marvel at the Empire State Building in New York, or the world's biggest ball of yarn in Kansas. Similarly, only these large touristy temples enjoy this revenue. Small temples out in the country continue to be starved out financially. Nonetheless, I think Buddhism is at risk in Japanese society. On the one hand, there is the risk of losing financial support and monastic staffing due to the factors I've mentioned earlier. But on the other hand, there's also the risk of political radicalization, such as has happened with many NRMs in Japan and with Christianity in the West. Should it be saved? I don't know. It's not my place to say one way or the other as an American. If the majority of Japanese people walk away from it and it dies, then that is the will of the majority. It is their thing and they can set it down if they don't want to carry it anymore. However, Buddhist institutions, like other major religious organizations, maintain a great deal of historically important texts, relics, and traditions that I think are valuable to maintain. Humanity has already lost a great deal of interesting and important texts, ritual, tradition, and relics to war, persecution, and the passage of time. For better or worse, Buddhism and all of the materials and rituals associated represent a dimension of human nature, and it is never a good thing for something like that to disappear into the fog of history. So where does the path forward lead? Only time will tell.
We hope you've enjoyed today's discussion of anti-Buddhist thought in Japan. Join us next week for our 100th regular episode, where we will be revisiting one of our earliest episodes, episode 2. Who is the Buddha? Is the Buddha a god? Is there more than one Buddha? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Thank you to Tanner, Wooly, and Adine for backing us on Patreon. We really appreciate your support. Just a quick reminder, the Patreon page for Bright on Buddhism will be shutting down at the end of this month, November 2024. We have made a statement about why on the Patreon page. You can find that at patreon.com/brightonbuddhism. Thank you. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.